Hello everyone, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. It was just a small scratch on Tu Diem's hand, yet it made Toan stop everything, afraid she might hurt even a little more. In that brief moment, something quietly shifted between two people long used to enduring in silence. And now let's explore the story of Toan and Tu Diem together and see whether these simple moments are enough to keep them side by side in the days ahead. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. Morning light slipped through the cracks of the wooden door and settled softly on two people sitting by a firewood stove that was still warm. Toan held a dry longan branch in his hands and turned it slowly. His voice was low and steady, breaking the familiar silence of the house. Fresh wood burns poorly. Only branches cut long ago and dried long enough can be used. He spoke plainly, repeating a lesson anyone who lives in the countryside understands. Across from him, Tu Diem listened closely. Her eyes brightened. The early air was cold and sharp, but the words between them warmed the space. She spoke slowly with certainty. Celebrating Tet together this year made her feel happy. She wanted everything prepared carefully, done properly. So this Tet would be complete, so those days would feel calm and secure. Toan looked at her. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. He nodded. He did not say much. He wanted the same thing. A joyful Tet, simple and full. With her by his side, no grand promises, just a few plain sentences. Each one carried feelings held back for a long time. They agreed not to harvest today. That could wait. The whole day would be for gathering firewood. Wood for steaming ban chung. Wood to keep the fire going through the long, rainy days ahead. Outside, the morning breeze moved through the trees. The scent of damp earth and old longan drifted in the air. In that quiet space, a small hope began to grow. Not hope for wealth, just hope for steady presence, day after day. Toan stood up and looked out at the yard covered in thin mist. His voice remained calm as he spoke of familiar routines. In the countryside, Tet preparations usually start around the 20th day of the lunar month. Firewood comes first, then cakes, then all the small things that follow. Tu Diem nodded. There was quiet resolve in her eyes. They began to prepare. Toan lifted the kettle off the stove to cool. He took the knife and reminded her to close the door and change into warmer clothes. She smiled lightly and said it was fine. Then they stepped outside together. The narrow path up the hill was red earth, damp with dew. They walked side by side. Their steps were even, unhurried. The rhythm matched naturally, as if they had always walked this way together. Reaching the slope, Toan pointed to scattered dry branches. Old longan limbs, dry enough, waiting to be collected. Tu Diem bent down right away. She lifted one branch, pressed it lightly to test the dryness, then looked up at him with a faint smile. The stillness of morning gave way to the rhythm of work, the sound of the knife cutting, the crack of dry wood, leaves crunching underfoot. They spoke very little, only short, familiar phrases. Toan passed her the knife. Tu Diem pointed out the driest pieces. Everything flowed smoothly, as if they had done this together for years. Higher up, the wind grew stronger, carrying the smell of seasoned wood and open sky. The work was heavy, but there was no distance between them. As they climbed higher, the wind cut sharper. The path narrowed, wild grass brushing against stones. They stopped before a pile of old longan branches. Brittle pieces, bark long gone, left behind through many seasons. Tu Diem crouched and gathered the loose ones. Her voice lifted slightly. There is a lot up here. Toan scanned the ground and began stripping the remaining branches. His knife was sharp. The cracked bark came away cleanly. They worked almost in silence, speaking only when needed. Toan shouldered a heavy bundle and carried it down first. Sweat traced lines across his forehead. Tu Diem watched him, concern entering her voice. "Why didn't you wait so we could carry it together?" Toan answered simply, "No blame, just reassurance. 2 more trips and it's done. Then each of us carries one." When tying the bundles, Toan handed her the rope. Her hands moved quickly, though they trembled slightly from the weight. They warned each other on the way down. "This path works, that way is faster." The wind rushed past, carrying the breath of earth and sky, yet the distance between them felt small. Each time Toan asked if it was heavy. Each time Tu Diem said it was fine. The shared rhythm continued. No matter how hard the work, they wanted to carry it together. The sun climbed higher. Pale gold light spread across the pile of newly gathered wood. They tossed each bundle down into the yard. Dry wood clattered sharply as it hit the ground. They stacked everything neatly. Their shirts were dark with sweat. Tu Diem swept away the scattered fragments. Toan inspected the pile. His voice stayed even. "These ones are still fresh. Let them dry longer. Use the others first." Both of them looked toward the distance. Grey clouds were gathering. The rainy season was close. A quiet concern threaded through their words. They talked about covering the wood, finding something to shield it, or building a simple roof to keep it dry. Toan carried the seasoned bundles inside, one by one, safe from the rain. Tu Diem cleared the yard carefully, leaving no corner untouched. When the work was done, they sat on the porch to rest. Toan poured water and handed it to her. He asked if she was tired. She shook her head and smiled softly, though concern lingered in her eyes for the long, wet days ahead. Toan looked at the neatly stacked firewood, then at her. In that moment, he said he would go back up the hill whenever there was time, so she would always have enough to burn. The air had changed. The urgency of labor was gone, replaced by a calm earned through effort. A cool breeze passed through, and between them, the bond deepened. Not only working side by side, but caring for each other and preparing together for what was coming next. Midday passed slowly. The sunlight softened and lost its sharp edge. Long, quiet streaks of light stretched across the red earth yard, revealing wheel tracks and footprints left from the morning work. Toan and Tu Diem did not rest for long. They moved on to the next task, as if it had already been decided. They needed to gather rotted straw and soil to prepare for planting flowers. The wheelbarrow was pulled out and set along the narrow path. Its iron wheel rolled slowly, grinding steadily against the dry ground. The sound was familiar, calm, unhurried. Toan shoveled soil one load at a time. His movements were firm and even. He tipped the earth into the wheelbarrow and pressed it down lightly so it would not spill. Tu Diem stood beside him, pulling apart layers of decayed straw. The straw was soft and crumbly, carrying the dull scent of old sun and damp earth. Sweat began to appear on both of their foreheads. No one complained. This kind of tiredness was familiar. As the pile grew higher, Toan used the hoe to level it carefully. He slowed down, making sure the surface was even. Tu Diem raked the straw loose, spreading it out so no section was too thick. They did not need to discuss what to do. Each person knew their part. Their rhythm stayed aligned. When the soil was ready, Tu Diem picked up the broom and swept away the remaining debris. She worked close to the edges, careful not to miss anything. An old piece of rusted wire stuck out from the straw pile unnoticed. When the broom brushed against it, the wire sprang up and pierced her hand. She froze. A small sound escaped her lips. Her fingers trembled slightly. It was not loud, but it was enough. Toan dropped the hoe immediately. He did not hesitate. He crossed the space between them in a few quick steps. His voice lowered. "Let me see your hand. Does it hurt?" He held her hand gently and turned it over, examining the scratch closely. The wound was not deep, just a scrape. But his eyes darkened. He spoke slowly. He said he did not want her to get hurt like that, not even a little. His voice was calm but heavy, as if the pain had not stayed in her hand, but moved straight into him. Tu Diem shook her head. She kept her voice steady. "It's fine. It doesn't hurt anymore. Just a small scratch." She smiled lightly to reassure him. But Toan did not let go right away. His fingers closed around her hand for another moment, as if trying to hold back even that small discomfort. In that moment, the work stopped completely. There was no sound of tools, no movement. Only real concern remained. Toan said he could finish the rest by himself. He said it plainly, as if it were obvious. Tu Diem refused at once. Her voice was firm. "I can do it. It's nothing. There's no need to make it bigger." They continued working, but the air had changed. Every movement afterward was a little slower. The care between them carried more weight now. It ran deeper, quiet but steady, like a thin mark carved into something solid, not easily erased. The afternoon breeze passed through the yard. The scent of damp soil and sun-dried straw drifted around them. The work came to an end. No one said much, but both of them understood. This was not just about working together. It was about protecting each other, even in the smallest moments. Late afternoon light turned golden. The dirt road leading to the market looked softer, less harsh. Toan drove with Tu Diem riding behind him. She held their bags tightly, keeping them steady. The ride was slow and even. They stopped first at the helmet shop. Toan chose carefully. He picked up each helmet, checking the size and color. He adjusted the strap with care. His voice was gentle. "This color suits you." Tu Diem tried it on and looked at herself in the mirror. She smiled. The smile was clearer than it had been all morning. Next was the light shop. They selected strings of small bulbs with soft light, not too bright. Just enough to hang around the porch and yard. In their minds, they could already see Tet night. The yard glowing quietly, not bright, but warm. At the flower stall, the mood shifted completely. The vendor pointed to each pot. Pink camellias, red camellias, yellow marigolds. Tu Diem chose carefully. She bent down, touched the petals lightly, checked the soil and leaves. Her eyes lit up with each choice. Toan stood beside her. He did not rush her. He did not interrupt. He nodded at each pot she selected. His attention stayed on her more than on the flowers. On the way home, the motorbike carried pots of flowers. Tu Diem cradled them from behind, holding them steady. Toan drove more slowly than before. When they reached the farm, they set each pot down in the yard. They dug holes, planted each one, covered the roots, watered the soil. Toan dug deep, shaping the holes neatly. Tu Diem placed each plant inside and straightened the stems. They switched tasks naturally, without speaking. When it was time to water, Toan scooped water and rolled up his sleeves to keep dry. He handed the water to Tu Diem first, so she could wash her hands. A small detail, but deliberate. The sun sank lower. Soft light settled over the newly planted flowers. The work ended in a quiet, comfortable stillness. The farm was changing little by little. Not just soil and plants, but the feeling of waiting for Tet to arrive. They stood there for a moment, looking at the yard. Then they looked at each other. Their smiles were light and unspoken, not because the flowers were beautiful, but because they had done all of this together, from beginning to end.
Hai người bắt đầu ngày mới trong căn nhà gỗ, bàn chuyện gom củi, chuẩn bị Tết. Toàn hiểu rõ củi khô quan trọng thế nào, còn Tứ Diễm mong một cái Tết đầy đủ, yên ấm. Họ cùng lên đồi, đặt cây nhãn khô, chia việc tự nhiên, lặng lẽ nhưng gắn bó.